Very warm welcome to the new episode of Ink and Insights. This is your host, Sumit Sharma Samir. If you want to listen to some of the leading voices from around the world in different fields, please subscribe to my channel. I'm extremely pleased to welcome James Stauch in my program today. James Stauch has authored or co-authored many guides, scans, and trend analysis on a range of contemporary social issues. A social innovation and system change educator and consultant based in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, in Canada. He serves as a co-chair of the BAF Systems Summit and as complex systems strategist with ATCO's Space Lab. James is a visiting fellow at the School Center at the Side Business School, University of Oxford, and was the founding executive director of the Institute for Community Prosperity at Mount Royal University, where he developed social innovation, leadership, and systems-focused learning programs for undergraduate students and the broader community. James has also been a foundation executive and philanthropy consultant, which included designing and managing Arctic and Northern programming with the Gordon Foundation. Having chaired several national and international grant-making networks and consortia, James is currently a board member of Alberta Eco Trust Foundation and a member of the editorial advisory board of the Philanthropist Journal. In today's episode, we'll talk about his book, The 55 Minutes and Systems Thinking and Innovation. James, welcome to Ink and Insights with Sumit Sharma Samir.
Hi, Sumit. Real pleasure to be here.
James, let's start with your book, The 55 Minutes. What inspired this title and what is its central message?
Yeah, so I'll show you the cover. Here's the book. It'll look backwards, but you'll see that there's a brain image on the front. We went through many different design possibilities before we chose this stylized brain image. And the brain image has a number of dots. There's actually 12 dots, 11 of which are orange, and the one down on the brainstem there is white. Those dots correspond, in a sense, with an analog clock. So if you imagine looking at an analog clock on the wall, there are 11 5-minute increments totaling 55 minutes, and then one 5-minute increment. And the inspiration for the title comes from an alleged quote by Albert Einstein, where he said, if I was given 1 hour to solve a very difficult problem and my life depended on it, I would spend the first 55 minutes just thinking about the problem and only the last 5 minutes thinking of how to act or how to solve it. And our argument in the book is that we actually live in kind of westernized, modern, cosmopolitan society. We tend to focus disproportionately on that last 5 minutes. Everything about our education systems, our commercial systems, our systems of care, whether it's health care or care for the aged and so on, tend to really focus on action and value action. And so if you look at all of our institutions, government needs to show that they're acting quickly because there's an election happening in the next few months or few years. Corporations need to act so that they can report quarterly or annually to their shareholders. Very few institutions have a much longer time horizon. And so the idea of taking that time to really understand the problem and to ask yourself, are we actually dealing with a symptom of a problem, or are we dealing with something that is foundational? That is a luxury that most of our institutions simply do not have. But also, we don't have many tools for thinking about how to use that time wisely. Do you just sit and contemplate in a room? Well, that's helpful, but you need to do more than that. Is it just about research? It involves a lot of research, but it's not just about research, and it's about a special kind of research. So this is essentially a guide, and we call it an atlas because it's more of a reference tool. You can start anywhere. You don't have to start at the beginning. And it's essentially a guide or an atlas or a roadmap for really using those metaphorical 55 minutes wisely. So it took us about 5 years to produce it, from idea, the inception of the idea, to actually getting it into print. So it's been quite a journey.
Right, James. I mean, that's very interesting. The emphasis that you are trying to give to the 55 minutes more compared to that of later 5 minutes. How do human society in today's context, for that matter, would address that, given, as you rightly stated in your response earlier on, the complexity, the fluidity, and the speed, we live with?
Yeah, I mean, since the end of the Second World War, we've now had about 8 decades of increasing acceleration. So some historians even call it the Great Acceleration. What that means is we see change happening more and more rapidly, whether it's technological change, whether it's social change, and embedded in the social are things like economic change and financial change, and change of our institutions, change of our lifestyles. And that has an enormous amount of complexity just inherently, what you might call ontological complexity. It just is complex. But also, we have much better communication across nations, across divides. I mean, you and I are talking without any lag, high quality sound, at completely polar opposite parts of the world. And that would have been unthinkable just decades ago. And so all of this complexity is compounded by what we sometimes call cognitive complexity, the complexifying of reality in our minds. We are much more aware of global conflicts, for example. Whether or not there are more global conflicts, they are more present in our mind, and they're more personalized. We can see images, we can see names, we can read stories of people who are involved in these conflicts. And because our networks are now global, we probably know somebody who has been affected in one way or another by these conflicts. So that's just a small example of how it's not just that things are complexifying, it's that our sense of the world, how we interpret the world, is also complexifying. And it's an open question as to how much complexity can human beings actually handle before we start to close it out or oversimplify or react or have some kind of a backlash against it. So we find that any means to make complexity more approachable, more understandable, are helpful to understanding modernity itself. And so we lean quite heavily on a family of tools and frameworks and concepts that broadly are often under the title of systems thinking. So we feel that it's more useful to approach reality and to approach, in a sense, the problem landscape with the notion that every problem is caused by some kind of system, whether that's intentional or not, whether that system is designed by humans or not, and understanding that system, developing those tools to really dig into and appreciate that everything is part of a system, that can help you really start to navigate and unravel the complexity and make it make more sense.
Right, right. So, James, before I get into the systems thinking as such, can you please highlight how can readers use the concept in the 55 minutes in their own work or lives, especially those not in the social innovation sector?
Yeah, well, the book is aimed at a very general audience. And this was a challenge for us because we based the book on, in part, on a much earlier guide we did that was just for students. And these were students who were part of a global systems mapping challenge, university age students or college age students. And so we call that guide a student's guide to mapping a system. But it was much more tightly focused on a small set of tools for understanding a difficult social problem and sort of mapping that out so that you could communicate quite clearly to a general audience what is the nature of this problem as best we know or as best we understand, and what are its various dimensions. So that was kind of our early, in a sense, beta version of this. And as we started writing it, we thought, oh, well, we're just writing a practitioner's guide to mapping a system. But actually, it quickly dawned on us that that's, first of all, that's kind of boring. When you hear that in your head, you're like, well, how does that going to help me? And it's not about mapping systems. It's about understanding problems in a context of complexity. So then if you start to go, well, who's experiencing problems in a context of complexity? I think the tougher question to answer is who is not. So it's everyone from the technical professions, engineers, people trying to work on or understand or unravel AI, because there's a remarkable similarity between many of the tools and even many of the origin stories of AI and systems thinking, right down to teachers, doctors, other health professionals, entrepreneurs for sure. We have many sections, many anecdotes in the book that are really targeted to entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs and people who are trying to problem solve, but in contexts that are, again, pushing them towards ideation, design, invention, perhaps too quickly in many cases. I'll give you one example. We have, by varying estimates, anywhere between 8,000 and 15,000 mental health apps that you can install on your phone and provide varying degrees of support or help with mental health issues. Well, in one sense, that's great. There's a lot of choice. In another sense, that's actually evidence that many entrepreneurs who've developed these tools have done so in a bit of a bubble, meaning they haven't sufficiently looked at the landscape of what's out there, not just the market, but the potential competition. And so how many of these apps have done the real difficult work of truly understanding the nature of the problem and understanding the landscape of solutions? Who's already out there who might have an app that's identical to yours or very similar? Can you work with them? Can you help them scale? Can you do something that's sufficiently different or complementary to what they're doing? And we see time and time again that innovation often happens in this kind of artificial bubble where people are discouraged from looking too closely at the surrounding landscape. And it ends up being one of the reasons that businesses fail at such a high rate, because you just haven't sufficiently done that work, that upfront work.
Right, right. So, James, in such a context, as you are rightly engaged and deeply engaged in systems change, how do you define systems thinking, and why do you think is essential today more than ever?
Yeah, so there's two parts to systems thinking. One is, of course, systems. So, what is a system? We maintain that virtually everything, all of reality, is somehow contained in a system or somehow represented by a system. And so a system is simply made up of parts, or you might call them elements or nodes. They're the stuff in the system and they have to have some kind of interaction or connection that has some characteristic of a relationship. It might be a transactional relationship, but it might actually be quite tightly bound or tightly coupled. And then the overall purpose of a system is distinct from what any of its parts do. So a car functions independently of what any of its parts do. If you just have a heap of car parts, that doesn't result in a car. And so it's how those parts function with each other that produces some kind of emergent reality, something that was there that could not be there without that system. Now, when you look at it, it's not just, I mean, it's obvious when we're talking about machines or when we're talking about healthcare systems or education systems. But it's maybe a little less obvious at a more granular level, where you're talking about chemicals, for example, or even subatomic particles. Those are all systems. If we look at mass itself, it's an emergent reality at an atomic scale that is really just the kinetic motion of quarks inside protons and neutrons that produce this thing we experience and call mass. So the thinginess of things, meaning their mass, is an emergent property. So as you start to really look at this at all scales, you start to ask yourself the question, can anything be understood as anything but a system?
Non-comprehensible. I also had an opportunity to talk with the professors from Australia. He was talking about the idea of big history, wherein he was outlining the historical evolution of mankind that was tied up with the history of evolution itself. It looks like James is also heading towards that direction, when you are trying to tell us that, how all the things are interconnected. And it's completely, it's difficult for the common mind to kind of comprehend all these things together, isn't it, James?
It is, and it's also a really, it's particularly difficult for the West, the European and European influenced nations to come to this realization. I think most cultures in most parts of the world would just simply say, "Well, of course, that is the nature of reality. Yes, we've known that." And indigenous peoples in North America, for example, have always said everything is connected to everything, and the most fundamental, in a sense, unit of reality, the most important thing that binds everything together, is relationships. And so when they say we are all related, they're not just talking about people and not just talking about animals and not even just talking about plants, but literally everything, whether it's an animate or an inanimate object. And that's not a metaphor. That really is how reality is seen. And so for us in who were raised in more of a binary, linear, reductionist cultural context and educational context, it's a really, really difficult thing to get our head around and to start to. So much of the book we see as speaking to that. Our assumption is most of our readership will be also educated in a Western frame or brought up in that Western binary, largely linear, largely reductionist frame. And so that's really who the book is mainly targeted towards. So many others may read it and say, well, yeah, we knew all this. and, but I think it's trying to make that bridge. And the other, so systems thinking is most importantly about thinking. Yes, it's useful to know about systems, but what we really try and emphasize is that it requires some mental exercises that we may or may not be comfortable doing or may not be used to. And so how do we step away from looking at the world as black and white, right and wrong? It's very difficult if you're in a cultural context where there is one right way and one wrong way, or one true God and one true embodiment of evil. Let's say those binaries don't reflect the reality of most problems and the contexts in which most problems emerge. You have many contexts in which two completely opposite things can both be right. That is true all of the time. And if you can't hold those two things as true or holding potential truths, then you'll have a very difficult time with systems thinking. And so we say in the book, if you are ideologically committed to one particular ideology, you will have a a lot of struggling with a book like this, and you'll have a lot of struggles with this way of thinking, because you have to be able to conceptually leap across those divides and imagine why somebody may form the opinions they do. They have their own rational reasons for coming to those points of view, and their own experiences that have led them to that. And so it's not an appeal to be morally relativistic at all. But we are saying you need, in order to engage with complexity, you need to appreciate why things are complex and contested, and why there are so many different points of view and perspectives on something. And if you can bring in as many of those points of view as possible, you can get much closer to understanding the context of the problem and to tackling the problem in a way that is more sustainable, durable, anti-fragile.
तिमीसँग अब धेरै टाइम छैन है, बिहे गर्नु छ भने गरिहाल, नत्र घरबाट मलाई अन्त्य बिहे गरिदिनु।
भर्खर 3 वर्ष भयो एमबीबीएस जोइन गरेको, 5 वर्षको कोर्स हो। के भो? अचम्म छ। एक्सक्यूज मी सर मेरो 5 वर्षको कोर्स 3 वर्षमा सकाउन मिल्दैन?
गेट आउट।
हेलो,
के सोच्यौ त?
के सोच्ने? मैले प्रिन्सिपलसँग पनि कुरा गरिसके। 3 वर्षमा पनि के हुन्छ? के हुन्छ 3 वर्षमा?
के भयो भाइ? ल बस। साउजी एक कप चिया। कसले भन्यो 3 वर्षमा केही हुँदैन भनेर? यो हेर, एलआईसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजनामा 3 वर्षमा पैसा फिर्ता हुन्छ।
ए हो र?
जीवन बीमाको साथमा धनवृष्टि 3 वर्षमा एलआईसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजना। एलआईसी नेपाल।
Warm services to delight your senses. Taking hospitality to newer heights. Nepal Airlines.
Completely agree with you, James. I think it's also largely depend on how the cultural context of a particular society molds individual and society to understand and kind of, allow them the space to sort of think through the shoes of the others, so that, I love the statement that you made. Every opposing views could be equally right. I mean, that's what I could paraphrase if I could synthesize it from what you have just said. But James, please tell me, what do people most often misunderstand about systems change?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think I've come across some people, and this is fairly rare, but there are some people who have a tiny minority of academics, and a far too small a minority of academics have actually studied systems their whole academic career. We need more of those people, by the way, but the few that do exist, among them, there are some who, in a sense, and this is ironic, have developed systems thinking or systems approach, or what they might call system science, into a discipline. And I think if you are thinking in systems, you have to be committed to being anti-disciplinary, at least interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, but ideally anti-disciplinary, meaning, a problem is a problem, and any problem has many aspects to it. They might, problem might have, let's look at, for example, rising rates of drug use in certain countries and certain regions. We in Canada have issues with fentanyl, with methamphetamines, and the use has been rising quite rapidly for a number of years. And so what kind of a problem is that? Well, some would see it as a medical problem. Some would see it as a health problem, or a social problem, or an economic problem, or a trade problem, or a border security problem, or an employment problem, and on, right? It's all of those. And so if you're trying to get a handle on the issue, you can't just say, well, it's because of our physiological propensity for addiction. No, there's got to be a deeper explanation. You can't just say it's about lax border controls or border security. It's all of that and much more that I haven't mentioned. And that's not meant to paralyze us. It's not meant to lead to inaction, but it really is meant to lead to smarter action, and action that looks a little less like a big hammer and more like a fine set of surgical tools. And that's really what we're talking about is any of these problems require a kind of thoughtfulness and curiosity and a set of fine calibrationally capable tools, rather than, oh, I know what this is. I've seen this before, and here's my hammer, and we're just going to try and bang it into place just like every other problem. And that's that. I mean, in some ways, and we say this right up front, so much of systems thinking is common sense. But you will get a faction of systems scientists saying, no, there's only one way to do systems thinking. You have to know the terminology. You have to know that you have to be schooled in this for a long time. There are too many interlopers, too many imposters that have claimed to be systems thinkers. Well, our point of view is that most of humanity, for most of human history, we're systems thinkers. But in the contemporary West, as much as we appreciate what the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution have brought to humanity in terms of understanding the cosmos or understanding human health, those are all valuable. But we have lost a lot in the process. And it's simply an appeal to re-engage those latent skills and those latent capacities for observation. So it's not about a particular set of tools that you need years to learn. It's about everyone can use these, and you can use them to the degree you have time and comfort to use them. They're utterly scalable. They're not meant to be, oh, now I've read the 55 minutes, I've graduated my systems thinking school, and now I can call myself a systems thinker. No, that's not what we're trying to get across here. And we are, by the way, most of the tools in here are not our own tools. They are other people's tools developed in many cases many decades ago. And we're just grouping them and helping people. We're introducing people to these tools, but you will, any kind of practitioner will open up the book and go, well, I recognize this one, or I know these 5 tools, but I've never heard of these other 5. So we formally talk about 30 tools, each of which we actually provide this is how we've used the tool, this is how others have used it, and this is how you can use it. Here are some ideas for how to use it. It is not, though, a facilitation guide. It's not at the level of detail where you say, you're going to need 5 sheets of flip chart paper and 7 pens of this color and 35 minutes to complete this task. No, we don't go into that level of detail because there are so many of those guides out there. And by the way, we make this book as a PDF, open access, and freely available to anyone, anywhere in the world. So we, it is more useful. I find it more useful if you actually do order a hard copy, but we recognize there are financial barriers to doing that. And so we make the PDF available for free on the website at the55minutes.com.
Yeah, I already have a copy of it, James, but I would recommend my colleagues as well, and I'll share that as well. James, looking back, what sparked your commitment to systems change and social innovation? Was there any defining moment for you?
No, not one defining moment. I think it revealed itself in layers. And but I will tell you one distant early memory that I recount in the book briefly, it's the first time I realized there's a very strong overlap between systems thinking and game theory. So there's many people who are really into game theory and thinking of problem solving in terms of approaching it as a game. And we don't lean heavily in that direction, but I think that's valuable to look at, because I remember, and I recall this in the book, when I first realized that education was a game. So it was in the first grade, and up until that point, it just seemed like common sense that you shared your work with everyone openly and freely. And so if you did an art assignment or a math assignment, you'd share that freely with others. And sometimes they'd copy you, and sometimes they'd make it better and improve on it, and so on. But very quickly, you learned this thing called a test or an exam or an assignment that was graded. And you realize there's actually an incentive to withholding your work from your peers. And so you can improve your own score vis-a-vis your peers if you withhold the information, if you don't share that. I mean, that's a very early form of intellectual property, right? You realize, oh, okay, my smarts can be, in a sense, enclosed or made property, and that can benefit me. It will not benefit my peers, but the less they benefit, the more I benefit. And so, and I share that story because it was and it seared into my brain. I remember it well. And I remember that being an important step on my journey away from systems thinking. Coming back to systems thinking, I think the most important pieces for me, and everyone would have a different take on this, but for me, I worked for a number of years in and adjacent to Indigenous communities in northern Canada. These are communities that are less impacted by fewer decades of colonization. And so where cultures are still really strong, original cultures, and there are governance systems and institutional frameworks that strongly reflect cultural frameworks, which is less true the further south you go in North America, where there were much more of a colonial imprint. And so that was a great privilege for me, being able to see contexts in which completely different governance systems emerge, completely different value systems around voice and participation, around entrepreneurship, and where the dividing line is between, in the West, we have a very sharp dividing line between, oh, this is an entrepreneur over here, and this is a social entrepreneur over there. And those are false distinctions in other contexts. And so it was gradually dawning on me that an entire way of, in a sense, constructing my hardware, my mental models, they needed to be renovated, seriously renovated. And that's tough to do. So that some adult educators call that vertical learning, as opposed to horizontal learning. So horizontal learning is where you're just accumulating a lot of knowledge, often subject-specific knowledge, and becoming really good at that particular vocation. Whereas vertical learning is actually renovating your entire mental models of how you interpret the world and interpret reality. And that's painful and difficult in the moment. And it's really, it's like mentally working out, right? It's grueling and awful, and you examine your own assumptions, and you often feel like you're a complete idiot for, you're smart in one context, and you can be put in another context, and you cannot survive. You cannot make heads or tails of what's going on. But if you can do that enough times, you can start to develop models that are more, again, anti-fragile, more resilient, more robust, more sustainable, that can accept change more readily, can accept complexity more readily, and can certainly accept diversity more readily. And I think that's just, I mean, that happens all the time to human beings who are put in different contexts. If you grew up in the country and you find yourself in a city, that will do that, or vice versa, you know. Or if you are living in a different cultural context, you move from one continent to another. All these things will help develop more robust mental models and make you more likely to understand the multiple ways of viewing a problem, viewing its context, and viewing really all of reality.
Absolutely, James. Renovation of mental models is what is the need of the hour. On that note, James, I'd really like to thank you for your time. It was such a pleasure to have you in my platform, and I wish you good luck for all the work that you are doing, and also wish you good luck for your new book, James.
Thank you so much, Sumit, for having me on your show. And again, invite everyone to go to the 55minutes.com and download or order the book from there. So thank you very much.
Thanks, James.